Welcome to the CircuitPython Show. I'm your host, Paul Cutler. This episode, I'm joined by Joshua Lowe. Joshua is a Python entrepreneur who invented Edublocks to help bridge the gap from Scratch to Edublocks and then into Python 3. Joshua started learning Python in 2013 and wanted to find a way to make it easier for others to understand. Josh, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Tell me about Edublocks.
So Edublocks was a project that I started about 6 years ago now. It all surrounded this idea of, I've always been interested in computers and technology from a very young age. Being the age I am, 18, I've always been surrounded by, technology. And we were talking a few days ago about you not having an internet for a few days. I can't imagine life without the internet or, technology, just because I've always been surrounded by it. I've always been interested in technology, and it was around the time the Raspberry Pi came out, which was 2012 now, 10 years ago, which seems like a crazy thing to me. When the Raspberry Pi came out, it kind of stemmed this interest into the coding and programming side of technology. I'd always been curious about messing around with laptops and stuff, but I never really had any exposure to being able to code, being able to program, and messing about with hardware, that kind of stuff. And so in 2012, the Raspberry Pi came out, and about a year later, I joined a Raspberry Jam event. So Raspberry Jams are all across the world now. I'm sure most people know what they are. But they're like coding meetups for people interested in the Raspberry Pi or, other related things like CircuitPython, microbit, those kind of things. And I went along to this event and, I was really interested in, the coding side of things. And I started learning off Scratch. So learning Scratch, the drag and drop programming language. And building lots of different projects with Scratch. And, that's something that I really enjoyed for a few years. And all the different things you can do with it. Even programming stuff with the Raspberry Pi, like GPIO, that kind of stuff. But then after I'd learned Scratch for a few years and, done lots of projects with that, I kind of realized that, if I wanted to do this as a career, which was kind of set on at that point of, this is something that I'd like to do in the future, that I'd have to learn a text-based programming language. And kind of like the main one that you go to after Scratch, or at least in the UK anyway, I'm not sure how it is in other countries, especially in schools, you go from Scratch and then you go to Python. So I was kind of making this transition from, I've done Scratch for a few years. I was kind of used to how all the visual stuff worked. And then I have to make this jump to Python and, the text-based programming side of things. And like a lot of people who have picked up Python from nothing or, made the transition from block-based, text-based using Python, it was kind of a big jump between the two because, suddenly you're having this environment of a drag and drop block-based environment where, it's very visual. It helps you along the way. You can't really get any errors of that kind of stuff. To Python, where if you make the littlest mistake of, a missing capital letter, punctuation, indentation, that kind of stuff, you can get a red wall of text that, to a beginner means absolutely nothing. So I kind of wanted to create something that would bridge the gap between the two of, bring this block-based environment back, but also, have a text element to it of, why don't we put the text on the blocks so that you drag and drop in lines of code? So Edublocks kind of started as a platform where you could build stuff with the Raspberry Pi. So one of the early examples was Minecraft Pi. So you could interact with Minecraft on the Raspberry Pi and build projects with that.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, so that was a really kind of popular thing to kick it off. And later down the line, there was projects with GPIO pins and electronics. So that was kind of like the early start of Edublocks. And then from there, it extended to the microbit, then CircuitPython, and then Python on the web. So that's kind of like how it started.
Wow, that's a heck of a story. What inspired you to make Edublocks open source from the beginning?
It was through going to events like the Raspberry Jams and later PyCons and conferences like that. I got to meet a lot of people in the open source community and kind of learn how GitHub works and the benefits that making a project open source can bring. A lot of the success of Edublocks is kind of down to making it open source. I didn't really fully understand the impact of it at the time because, I'd seen like these big projects from like Microsoft and companies like that who would open source things like, well, not at the time, but MakeCode is an example of an open source project. I've seen that they got a lot of contributions from community members to make the project better. I never really thought that would happen to Edublocks, or making it open source would bring that kind of impact. But there was a big community around it that would submit issues, submit pull requests, and really dedicated to a project because they saw an idea and they believed in it and they wanted to help out. So yeah, it's been really helpful to make it open source, and kind of that community aspect of it is really important to the project and a lot of the work that I do. Being able to give back to the community and kind of have that community spirit around it. So that was kind of the main reason.
That's awesome to hear. So tell me a little bit more about Edublocks. Edublocks has different modes, and some of those modes can work with hardware. How does that work?
Edublocks started off as a tool for the Raspberry Pi. You could do basic stuff like the GPI opens, so projects was using them, and also Minecraft Pi. So they were kind of the two things at the start. And then it slowly extended into doing more basic things with Python. So, print hello world, that kind of stuff. And then later Python turtle. Yeah, that was kind of like the first mode, if you will. And then from there, the kind of whole Edublocks tool gained in popularity, and people wanted more things like support for the microbit was next. So being able to build projects with the microbit, scrolling stuff on the display. Same thing with the Raspberry Pi, being able to plug stuff into the pins on the microbit to build like physical computing projects. And then the next one after that was actually CircuitPython. And that came about through meeting Scott and Katney and Dan from the CircuitPython team at PyCon in 2018, I think it was. Hopefully I got that right. So yeah, PyCon 2018, I kind of met them, and I'd heard of CircuitPython before, but I never really had any exposure to it. So I hadn't really played around with the Circuit Playground and the other CircuitPython boards. And, after playing around with them at PyCon, I was like, yeah, I think this is the next kind of mode that I want to go for. So I introduced very similar things, being able to build physical compute projects, interact with the speaker and the NeoPixels on the circuit playground. So the modes are kind of like different sections of hardware that you can use, and then also alongside that, there's like a Python mode, which is this basic Python which you can run in the browser, and more recently, which isn't Python, HTML, so you can build websites and stuff like that. But it is mainly dedicated to Python because the range of hardware that supports it, and also Python just being the main text-based programming language that's used in schools here in the UK. And it is mainly a program for schools, but there are lots of home users that use it as well, enthusiasts who just want to learn how to code on their own. So it's a really wide range of users, and that's kind of like how the modes integrate with it.
Out of all of those users over the years, have you seen one or two projects that really stand out in your mind? Things that people have done with Edublocks that maybe you didn't expect?
I think probably instead of projects, I would probably say that the standout thing for me is, being able to see people who were kind of put off by that transition from Scratch to Python, and then going back and using Edublocks and being able to, pick up, text-based programming language. I think that's kind of like the standout thing for me, if I can think of one thing in particular, because I've always wanted to be able to pass on my knowledge and love for coding and computer science, all those kind of things to other people. But especially the problem that I was seeing in UK schools, at least, was people were being put off by the idea of coding and programming because they saw this horrible red line of text when they were learning text-based programming, and they'd had all this visual element of it taken away from Scratch when they were learning Python. So being able to provide something that helps people to kind of follow a similar path to me and be able to share, the love that I have for it, I think that's really kind of like the lasting legacy of it that I see, and the kind of big standout thing that I can think of.
Where do you see Edublocks going next?
It's a difficult question because it changes. It changes all the time. I kind of like what I want to do next with it. Yeah, I think obviously expanding the feature set. So one of the big things that I'm working on at the minute is tutorials and examples. So I really want anyone to be able to load up Edublocks and kind of have this guided tutorial experience where they can learn themselves and have like a self-guided learning experience. So that's kind of the main thing that I'm working on, lots of content and lessons and that kind of thing. So yeah, expanding the tutorial set, and also, I've got some different mode ideas that I want to kind of work on. Last year I introduced the ability to have extensions in the microbit mode. So being able to type in a GitHub URL, very similar to how MakeCode works, and extend the capabilities of the microbit mode to support different microbit libraries. Alongside the tutorials, the other thing that I want to do in the next release that I do is expand the extension capability to the Circuit Python mode and the Python mode. So you'll be able to use third-party libraries with those modes, which will be pretty exciting to see what that opens up.
We've been talking a lot about education. You graduated high school in 2020 just as the pandemic was starting to hit. What role do you think remote learning can play in education going forward?
I think the pandemic has kind of brought forward the use of lots of technology in the classroom, forward. And I think we're always going to see this shift to, you know, using tools like Google Classroom, Microsoft Teams, and things like that to be able to provide education to a wider range of people. But yeah, through the pandemic, all of a sudden people were forced to, kind of learn from home and, use all these new tools. And I think, the use of things like Google Classroom probably has, kind of died off a bit as people move back to the classroom. But I think things like that are always going to have a place now, where other subjects, when I was in my last year of high school, we used Google Classroom for all of our classwork, all of our homework, and, it's just a normal thing in that subject. But, I think things are going to move across all the subjects where, we kind of embrace technology, and technology is used across school. And I think also the pandemic's highlighted the need for wider access to internet. We just take for granted that everyone has an internet connection, but the pandemic's kind of made us realize that technology is not accessible to everyone, and the things that we enjoy, not everyone can access. So I think over the next few years, we're probably going to see a push to make internet, which at this point is, kind of something that's fundamental to, modern day life, but we just take it for granted. So I think we are going to see a big push, for making the internet more accessible for everyone, and also bringing more opportunities to people who might not have had them before. Things that we're really interested in, like building things with Circuit Python devices or learning how to code. These things are going to be really big over the next few years, I think. Where more jobs are involved in technology, and there's a greater need for people in software engineering and computing in general. I think there was a statistic that I learned at an event that I went to the other year, where 60% of jobs that will exist in, I think 10 years it was, or the age group that were there, 60% of jobs that this age group are going to, go for in the future, don't exist yet, because they're all related to future technologies and augmented reality, artificial intelligence, that kind of stuff. I think there is a real need to kind of push this whole switch to virtual learning and being able to make sure coding is accessible for everyone. I think the pandemic's really highlighted that, everyone needs equal opportunities to be able to access these things.
I absolutely agree. Well, we're almost out of time, but before we go, I have one last question I like to ask all of my guests. You're about to start a new project. Which microcontroller do you reach for?
So this is probably quite an easy one for me. So it has to be the microbit, specifically the microbit V2 that came out over a year ago now, actually, which is pretty hard to believe. So, and the thing I really like about the microbit is, it's a really cheap device, £13 in the UK if I got that right. But it's got lots of capabilities as well. So you've got Bluetooth, you've got a display where you can scroll messages. So that's a really fun beginner project. But you've also got the pins at the bottom where you can plug into lots of different add-on boards to be able to extend the capabilities. And yeah, I think the microbit and the features that the V2 brought, like the better processor, the onboard speaker, the touch logo, which is pretty cool. I think it's a really good beginner's board, but also it provides the capability to be extended into do lots of different advanced projects as well. So there's no kind of like limit with it. I think that's what I really like about the microbit. I think whilst the microbit's a really good general board, there's so many like other boards that I really like Like the Circuit Playground Express is one that I've really liked to use before. And some of the smaller trinket boards. Whilst the microbit's kind of like my favorite all-around board, there's lots of others that I really enjoy using as well.
That's a great pick. If people want to learn more about Edublocks or you, where should they go?
The best place is edublocks.org. You can find all the social links on there and also the guides and resources to get started and places to contact me if you've got any questions or you've got any queries or need any help with the project if you want to start using it. So that's probably the best place to go.
Josh, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the CircuitPython Show. For show notes, transcripts, and to support the show, visit circuitpythonshow.com. Until next episode, stay positive.